In a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, a geneticist stared at a screen full of numbers that did not make sense. The DNA had come from a sliver of bone, barely the size of a fingernail, pulled from a cave in the mountains of southern Siberia. It belonged to no known human, not fully. It carried fragments of code that matched no living population on Earth, and yet, somehow, traces of that exact code were sitting inside the bodies of people walking around Papua New Guinea today. For years, scientists assumed they understood the story of where humanity came from. One out of Africa migration, one clean branch of the family tree, one simple timeline written in stone, tools, and skull shapes. Ancient DNA has now torn that timeline apart. And what it has revealed instead is a story so much stranger, so much older, and so much more tangled than anyone expected. A story written not in textbooks, but inside the genome of every person alive today. Tonight, we're going to read that story. And by the end, you will understand why the deepest, oldest branches of the human family tree are found in a place most people never think to look, and why the answer to the question, which humans are the oldest, turns out to be far more scientifically precise and far more surprising than anyone assumed. Before we continue, if you find yourself drawn to the strange buried truths that ancient bones and ancient genomes are only now beginning to reveal, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps this kind of careful, evidence-based storytelling reach more people, and it costs you nothing. Now, back to Siberia and back to the beginning. To understand what ancient DNA has found, you first have to understand what scientists thought they knew before it arrived, for most of the 20th century. The story of human origins was built almost entirely from fossils. Researchers measured skulls, they compared jawbones, they argued over the shape of a brow ridge or the angle of a cheekbone, trying to piece together a family tree using nothing but the hard, silent evidence of bone. It was slow work, and it was often wrong. Fossils are rare. They are incomplete. They cannot speak. By the 1980s, a new kind of evidence had entered the picture. Geneticists studying the DNA of living people noticed something remarkable. Populations in Africa carried far more genetic diversity than populations anywhere else on the planet. Not slightly more, dramatically more. A single village in West Africa could contain more genetic variation than the entire population of Europe combined. At first, this seemed like a strange technical detail. It turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in the history of human origins research. Genetic diversity accumulates over time. The longer a population has existed, the more time mutations have had to build. Up within it, branch by branch, generation by generation. A population with enormous internal diversity is, almost by definition, a population with enormous internal age. When researchers ran the numbers, the conclusion was unavoidable. Modern humans arose in Africa, and they arose there a very long time ago, long before any human ever set foot on any other continent. This finding is now one of the most rigorously confirmed results in all of genetics, replicated across hundreds of studies, using different methods, different laboratories, and different populations, all converging on the same answer. But here is what scientists did not expect. The deeper they looked into African genomes specifically, the more the story began to fracture into pieces. Africa was not one ancient population. It was many. Certain groups, the San and other Khoisan-speaking peoples of southern Africa among them, carry genetic lineages that split away from the rest of humanity's ancestors an almost incomprehensibly long time ago, tens of thousands of years before the migrations, that would eventually populate Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In genetic terms, some of these lineages are, quite simply, the oldest continuously diverging branches of the entire human family tree that scientists have ever measured. Not the oldest in a poetic sense, the oldest in a precise, mathematically calculated, peer-reviewed sense, and this is where the story stops being simple. Because the deeper researchers dug into these ancient lineages, the more they found evidence of something nobody had predicted. Signs that modern humans in Africa had, at some point in the deep past, encountered other kinds of humans entirely. Humans who were not fully like us. Humans whose DNA should not have been there at all. That's where the story turns toward Siberia, and toward a discovery that changed everything scientists thought they understood about how many kinds of humans once shared this planet. In 2008, in a cave called Denisova, tucked into the Altai Mountains near the borders of Russia, Mongolia, and China, archaeologists uncovered a fragment of bone from a child's finger. It was tiny, unremarkable to look at. Nobody expected it to matter much. Researchers sent it to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo had been perfecting techniques for extracting DNA from bones that were tens of thousands of years old. What they found inside that finger bone did not match Neanderthal DNA. It did not match modern human DNA either. It matched nothing anyone had ever sequenced before. The scientists had discovered an entirely new branch of the human family, later named the Denisovans. known to this day almost entirely through genetic evidence rather than a full skeleton. And then came the truly unexpected part. When researchers compared this ancient Denisovan genome against the DNA of living people around the world, they found something that should not have been possible if human evolution had really been one clean, single migration out of Africa. They found Denisovan DNA sitting inside living human beings. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, in Melanesia, in Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia, and across scattered islands of the Pacific. Modern people carry up to 4 or 5% Denisovan ancestry in their genomes today. That is not a rounding error. That is a substantial, measurable, unmistakable genetic inheritance from a population that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. It meant that at some point in deep prehistory, modern humans migrating out of Africa had encountered Denisovans somewhere in Asia, and the two groups had interbred. Their children survived. Their children had children, and the echo of that ancient meeting is still written into the cells of people alive right now. The Denisovan discovery was not an isolated case. Around the same time, genetic studies of Neanderthal remains, pioneered by many of the same Leipzig researchers, revealed that a very similar thing had happened much further west. Nearly everyone outside of Africa today carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 2%, inherited from encounters between modern humans and Neanderthals that took place in the Middle East tens of thousands of years ago, before modern humans fanned out across Europe and Asia. This is where the old, simple picture of human history fully collapsed. It was not one population of modern humans walking out of Africa into an empty world. It was modern humans walking into a world that already had other kinds of humans in it. And in many places, briefly and repeatedly, those populations met and mixed. Researchers writing in Nature and Science have since identified traces of at least 3, and possibly more, distinct archaic human populations contributing DNA to different modern populations around the globe. Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east, and hints of a third, even more mysterious ghost population whose full genome has never been recovered, detected only through statistical traces left behind in the DNA. Then the Neanderthal and Denisovan split, and its DNA has been found stitched into the genomes of some Central and West African populations, without any bones, without any fossils, without a single physical trace ever being found. Scientists know this population existed only because its genetic fingerprint is still present in the living. It is one of the strangest and most sobering demonstrations in all of science that a population can vanish entirely from the fossil record and still leave behind unmistakable proof of its existence, sealed inside the bodies of its unknowing. Genetic diversity is the clock scientists use to measure a population's age, and if certain African lineages branch off earlier than any others yet measured, and if those same populations show the least evidence of mixing with outside archaic groups, then the deepest, most ancient, most continuously diverging human lineages on Earth are not scattered. The most precise answer to that question has come from a series of studies focused specifically on southern Africa, and the results have surprised even the researchers who conducted them. In 2017, a team of geneticists led by researchers including Karina Schlabusch at Uppsala University published findings. Based on genome sequencing of individuals from Khoisan-speaking populations in southern Africa, groups that include the San peoples of the Kalahari, among the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies whose way of life has persisted in some form for an extraordinarily long stretch of human history. Using genetic divergence dating, a technique that calculates how long ago two populations' ancestors last shared a common source by measuring the accumulated differences in their DNA, the team estimated that the ancestors of the San diverged from the ancestors of other human populations roughly 200,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. That number matters enormously. It places the split at, or even before, the earliest fossil evidence of anatomically modern humans anywhere on the planet. In other words, according to the genetic clock, this lineage may be as old as the modern human species itself, branching away almost immediately after modern humans first emerged and then continuing to exist, largely on its own genetic path for 2,000 centuries. Other research groups, using different statistical methods and different population samples, have converged on similar figures, generally placing the deepest known split in the modern human family tree somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago, consistently locating it within populations native to southern and eastern Africa. This is not a fringe finding. It has been replicated across multiple independent studies published in journals, including Nature Communications and the American Journal of Human Genetics, using whole genome sequencing rather than the smaller genetic markers that earlier studies relied on. But here is what makes this discovery more complicated and more scientifically honest than a simple headline might suggest. Being the oldest continuously diverging lineage does not mean being the most unchanged, and it does not mean being somehow more original or more pure than any other population. Every human population alive today, without exception, has been evolving for the same total span of time since the origin of the species. The sand lineage did not stop evolving after it branched off. It continued adapting to the specific environment of the Kalahari for 200,000 years, developing its own genetic changes related to diet, disease resistance, and physiology, just as every other branch of humanity did in its own environment. What the deep divergence date actually measures is something more specific and more interesting than age in a simple sense. It measures how long that population's ancestors have been genetically distinct from other human populations, largely because of long-term geographic and social separation, not because that population is somehow closer to an ancestral, unchanged version of humanity. Researchers at institutions, including the Max Planck Institute, have been careful to emphasize this distinction, because the difference between deep divergence and any notion of being more evolutionarily advanced or authentic is exactly the distinction that pseudoscientific race theories of the past got catastrophically wrong. 19th and early 20th century race science attempted to rank human populations on a ladder of supposed evolutionary progress, placing some groups as more evolved and others as more primitive, and used crude, cherry-picked measurements to justify colonial and racial hierarchies that caused immense harm. Modern population genetics has done something almost the opposite of what that old pseudoscience attempted. It has shown that genetic variation among human populations does not sort into the discrete, ranked categories that race science imagined. There is no clean line separating one race from another in the genome, no single mutation or marker that defines a race, because human genetic variation is overwhelmingly continuous, gradual, and overlapping between neighboring populations. What the science does show is something more specific and more interesting: individual population lineages, defined by shared ancestry and geographic history, that can be dated with real precision, sitting within a family tree that includes every living human being as a close relative. The deep divergence of southern African lineages is a real, measurable, well-documented scientific fact. The idea of ranking entire races by age on top of that fact is not science. It is a distortion of science, built from a real discovery, but stretched into a claim that data does not support. And once you understand that distinction, the rest of the story, that unexpected discovery did not come from ancient bones at all. It came from looking at living people and finding a signal that should not have been there if the old, simple model of human origins had been correct. In 2011, a study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by geneticist Michael Hammer at the University of Arizona, analyzed genetic sequences from modern populations across sub-Saharan Africa. Buried inside the DNA of certain West African groups, the team found a segment of genetic material so different from anything else in the human genome that its closest estimated divergence date placed its origin more than 700,000 years in the past, far earlier than the split between modern humans and Neanderthals. There was no way a mutation alone could account for a difference that large. The only explanation that fit the data was interbreeding, meaning that modern humans in West Africa, tens of thousands of years ago, had encountered and mixed with an archaic human population so old and so distinct that it may have branched off the human family tree even before Neanderthals and Denisovans did. This population left no fossils that have ever been confidently identified. No skull, no jawbone, no tool assemblage has been matched to it with certainty. It is known only because its genetic echo survives, faintly, in the DNA of living Africans today, much the way Denisovan ancestry survives in the DNA of people in Papua New Guinea. Researchers have since found similar traces in other African populations, each pointing to slightly different, still poorly understood archaic contributions, suggesting that the human story in Africa was, if anything, even more complex and more layered than the story of interbreeding outside Africa that made headlines with Neanderthals and Denisovans, is finding forced scientists to abandon one of the last remaining pieces of the old simple narrative: the idea that Africa itself was one single uniform population that gave rise to modern humans in one clean event. Instead, the picture that has emerged from more than a decade of genomic research is of multiple semi-isolated human populations, existing across the African continent for hundreds of thousands of years, occasionally meeting, occasionally mixing, occasionally remaining separate for tens of thousands of years at a stretch, before modern humans, as we would recognize them today, emerged from that long, tangled process. Not from a single starting point, but from what researchers now often describe as an African multi-regional origin within the continent itself. From there, the now familiar migrations began. Genetic and archaeological evidence places the major dispersal of modern humans out of Africa somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, though earlier, smaller migrations that did not leave lasting genetic traces in most living populations appear to have occurred even before that. As those migrating groups moved into the Middle East, into Europe, into Central Asia, and eventually across the land bridge into the Americas, they encountered Neanderthals, eventually populate the rest of the world. Each of these migrations acted like a narrow doorway. Only a fraction of the genetic diversity present in the African populations that stayed behind passed through that doorway into the groups that left. This is why, to this day, populations outside Africa consistently show less overall genetic diversity than populations within it, a pattern sometimes called the serial founder effect, in which each new migration carries forward only a subset of the diversity of the population it came from, generation after generation, continent after continent. It is a quiet, elegant piece of evidence, written into the genome of nearly every person alive, that traces the entire route of human expansion out of Africa almost like a genetic breadcrumb trail. Put all of these threads together, the deep divergence of southern African lineages, the surviving echoes of Denisovan and Neanderthal interbreeding, the newly discovered ghost populations hidden inside West African genomes, and the serial founder effect that shaped every population outside the continent, and a very different picture of human history emerges than the one most people grew up with. There was no single moment of human origin, no clean starting line, no simple hierarchy of older and newer, more original and less original. There was a long, overlapping, continent-spanning process, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, involving multiple archaic populations whose names we are only now learning, whose full stories are still being pieced together one genome at a time. The oldest branches of the human family tree, measured with real scientific precision, are found in specific populations in Africa, a genuine and remarkable finding. But that finding sits inside a larger truth that the genome makes unmistakably clear. Every person alive today, however distant their ancestors' migrations took them, is the product of the same deep, shared, endlessly interconnected human story. And the closer scientists look, the more that story reveals just how thoroughly connected we all remain, written not in the myths people tell about themselves, but in the quiet, unarguable evidence carried inside every one of us.